I am the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women. And so in that job, my responsibility is to provide, training, technical assistance, those sorts of things to countries around the world. We're doing some work in Haiti right now, some work in the Bahamas, for example, work in Australia. So our, Minnesota is unique in that, our work in this regard in terms of domestic violence started, early. And so what we're, the history of our work has really been utilized around the world. So the Duluth model, is a method of organizing. And so the reason why it's so successful is because the Duluth model focuses on the voices of survivors. In a lot of communities, people will hear like, oh, they're doing something really successful over there or really successful over here. Let's try and do that. Well, the problem with that is they don't take the time to hear from the voices of victims in their own community. I mean, that's just the thing that's just so rare, and it just shouldn't be, right? So you get a lot of really smart people, really well-intended people sitting around a table talking about things that they've heard around the world that people are doing, and then they just try it, and that's a mistake. And the thing that the Duluth model centralizes is the voices of victims. And so, in including those voices of victims in their work. So we told the men that they had to come to group with an example of a time where they knew that they crossed the line with their partner, and they got to decide what crossed the line meant. Okay, so we let them decide that. And so a number of men were giving examples and stories of things that they had done to their partners, and we let it be anything this time. And so what we worked to them to figure out is what's the core belief, right, that underlies that. And so one of the guys said, he goes, I just think that I think I'm right all the time and that I'm just smarter than she is, right? And I said, how about the rest of you? Have you ever had that thought, like, she's just stupid or I'm smarter? And most of them had, right? So the example is that until they change that thinking, right, that they're smarter, and in particular, they think this of women, right? And this is why anger management didn't work, because they weren't generally angry to everyone. It was just towards their partners because they saw women differently in heterosexual relationships. So they believed they got to do certain things and their partner didn't get to do certain things. So as part of this work, we work with them. And so the thing I said to them yesterday, for example, is, so I want you to know, you can't just say, I'm going to stop doing this thing I did with my partner because you still think that way. You'd have to actually change your thinking and replace it with something else, right? And they were like, well, what might that be? And they had a really hard time thinking about what that might be, in part because they're so attached to their own thinking, right? And they just think they're right. And I said, well, could you imagine thinking, I'm going to enter into this conversation with my partner, and I think I might have some things to learn from her, that she might have some things to bring to the conversation. And that was a struggle for them. It was a real struggle for them to think that they could actually accept that thinking, right, in their mind. And so, there's a lot of debate in the men's group worlds, about what their roles should be, what their focus should be. And what we've sort of historically said is that we're not saying that men don't need therapy and that they don't have trauma. We know they do, right? But we're saying that that is not best addressed in these groups, right? That this is a widespread social problem, and men need to be together in groups to address these things. That we don't think it's the best method for them to talk about their most traumatic experience as a child in a group setting, because it didn't, that this thinking that's socially accepted is best to happen in a group process. I have family that interviewed with 3 girls. One of those girls does this work now, right? She works in the same field. Another one struggles with drug addiction, and the other struggles with eating disorders, right? So they all came out of it different. And so too often we think, the effects on children, but they're so wide and varied, right? And the thing that I don't think there's been enough study about is to is to understand that difference, right? About why the effects. Now, part of what we know is that most abusers try and pick a favorite child, right? They have a favorite child, that they need an ally in the home. And so they'll give one child in particular extra things, more things. And that's really, really common, right? And then there's always a child where they're the hardest on. It's usually the oldest or the youngest that they're the harshest on. So, that dynamic possibly is playing into that, but we're not really sure why. Another little girl, she was 9 and she was having what the doctor thought was seizures. And so she was living with her grandma at this time. So the grandma asked if I could take her to the doctor appointment. And I said, sure, I'm happy to take her. So I brought her to the doctor appointment. In the waiting room, she said, Melissa, can you keep a secret? And I said, well, I don't know. There's some secrets I can't keep. And I said, but you're welcome to tell me, knowing I may not be able to keep it. And she said, just so you know, I fake every seizure I have. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, every time I start to sense that my dad's going to yell at my mom and scream at her, I throw myself on the floor and like flop around like a fish, because we live by the lake and I've seen that. And I've seen that that's what seizures are. So I do that because then he stops yelling at her. Right. And so, that was not a secret I could keep, of course. But, there had been, thousands of dollars in MRIs, spent on this little girl and medical appointments to try and figure out, why she was doing this so often. So one thing, always I would say is advocating for housing options. A lot of victims go back because they can't find stable housing. Most of the shelters, it's only up to 30 days, and there's very little transitional housing, right? To go to an apartment, for example, or to a home. But when I worked at Advocates for Family Peace as a director there, for a while, we had a federal government grant where we got to pay first and last month's rent, deposit, and then up to 6 months rent, right? And that was, I just remember, because I was a director, so I got to sign those checks. And, we needed so many more of that in order for women to have safety, So there's that side of it, which is safety, is women need housing options and there just aren't any. So advocating for better housing options would really make a difference. And then the other piece is that it's, we sort of say that there's sort of these 3 rings of accountability that men have to have. And most community members are talking about are what we call in the 3rd ring. So the first ring is self-accountability. So he has to work to hold himself accountable. The second ring is the government, right? So in terms of our criminal justice system, our social services have to hold him, but we're in the community. So for example, one of the things we ask in men's group is we say to them, tell us about when you were arrested or you had an order for protection filed against you. Tell us about what your family members said, and what, sorry, there's a plane going by here. What the family members said and what you said, and tell us about the conversation. And most of the guys got messages from their community and their families and their coworkers, things like this. I mean, they say, well, my uncle said, you live in Minnesota, it's a woman's state. Another guy said, my coworker at work said, next time you have to hit her where the cops don't see it. Right. And so another guy said, yep, it was my mother, and my mother said that bitch deserved it. Right. And so part of it is that the men who do this, the silence when we don't talk about it is support. Right. So an example, and I always give this example just sort of in my own family, is that I had a family member who was experienced quite a bit of violence. She got divorced, and during Thanksgiving, he was coming to pick up his child. So they shared the day because they lived near each other in the divorce. So I'll just call him Bob. So Bob comes over to pick up his child. And when Bob comes over looking quite dapper in his long trench coat and such. And he's a college educated businessman. And when he comes, nobody says anything to him, right, about anything. And this had recently just happened, except for his ex-wife. And so his ex-wife after the child left to go in the car, he said, "So Bob, are you beating your next girlfriend? Have you started that already?" Right. And she does this in front of the whole family. Right. Now, we asked her later, like, how did you have the guts to say that? Right. And she said, because you were all there. Right. It's easy for me to say it when you're all there, but I need you to say it too. Right now, she says, maybe I probably shouldn't have said that. Right. But it's those little sorts of voices that men have to hear. They have to hear that they're in a culture, right, that doesn't think this is okay. And so anytime any of us, go and have a family member or friend or a neighbor who we know has done this, what we encourage people to do is to respectfully challenge them, right? Be respectful, yet challenge them, right? And then ask, how can I help you? What can I do to help you to not do this again, right? Now, lots of people do that with victims, but very few people do it with abusers because some of them are scared of them. There's lots of reasons, but most abusers, the majority of them, you're not their target at all, right? Now, you may become the target if he finds out you help her, but it's pretty rare that bystanders or helpers, get harmed. There certainly are cases. In fact, my best friend's brother was murdered when he stood in front of a woman. A man came in to shoot his wife, and my best friend's brother stood in front of, her, and he shot him and killed him. Right. So it does happen, but it's pretty rare. Yeah, so the thing that we want people to say, I just want you to know I know what happened, right? So first get rid of the secrecy of it. He needs to know that people know, right? That this is not a private matter, it's a public matter that affects, a lot of people, not just, her. Say, I just want you to know that I know that something happened, and I want you to know that I know that you hurt her, right? And the other thing I want you to know is that I want to help you, but part of me helping you is I won't engage in a conversation with you where you get to blame her. So I just want you to know that when I talk to you, I'm going to cut you off. Okay. And I know it's going to be hard for you because it's pretty common, for you to not blame her. But I don't care what she did. She didn't deserve that. But I want to help you. We looked back, and the last time someone did focus groups or interviews with victims in Minneapolis was 2005, right? And Minneapolis has changed a lot, right? So we're working, Domestic Abuse Project has a new director, Amithany Keefe, and we're working with her and coordinating. She works at Domestic Abuse Project, of course, right there in Minneapolis. So working with them and Cornerstone and a number of the advocacy organizations in Minneapolis to conduct focus groups, and particularly to ask them, when you're scared or need help, who do you go to, right? And if it's not the police, why not? In terms of what most prevalent studies say, it's 1 in 4 women, right, in the world. In terms of who those women are, the thing is that women who have resources often, they don't need a shelter. They don't call the police. They have a credit card where they can go to a hotel or leave or go to their friends. In Dallas, this is probably around, early 2000s. There was a wealthy woman in Dallas. Her name is Janice, and she experienced violence as a very wealthy woman, and she wanted to start a shelter for a very wealthy woman in Dallas. And the interesting thing is none of those wealthy women came there. So she ended up, she still kept the shelter open. It's called Genesis Shelter. And but she just said, I want a place where wealthy women who are experiencing, she said, because I know they're out there where they can come. And she said, she realized real quick, right, that they're not coming here. And there's also, there's a lot of public shame for wealthier women, to not call the police. So we can't think that it doesn't happen, in those families. But there's also a lot of pressure, by abusers in those families to not speak out. Women, of all races, ethnicities, cultures, and economic class will call the police when they're really scared, right? When they don't think anything else will stop him. Most women call for an intervention because they want the violence to stop, but it doesn't mean they want the relationship to stop. So that's why they're calling, is because in the moment, they can't handle it. Lots of women try to handle it right on their own by being nice, stop doing what he doesn't like, and it doesn't always work. And so that's why, it's pretty rare that people call the police, the first. Yeah. So this recently came out. I'm part of this listserv where there's a scientist, I believe he's in Spain, who was creating this some sort of, like that was that VR technology. Somebody created this technology where they're trying to use in men's group where men can be in the place of a woman, like trying to attack them, right? To give them that perspective. And people are like, oh, that sounds so cool, and blah, blah, blah. And one of my colleagues, Amanda McCormick, who's the partner of Ellen Pence, who started the Duluth program, she responded on that listserv so brilliantly. She just said, the thing is that we know what can end widespread violence against women. We're just not willing to commit to it, right? Which is that we'd have to end entitled thinking, but lots of people want to keep their power, right? We have to end the submission of women, and some women think that it is their job to be submissive, right? We have to end the objectification of women, right? The pornography industry has only grown in the last number of years, right? And we can't have impunity for accountability, that people have to be held accountable no matter what that means. And that doesn't have to mean by the traditional sort of police criminal justice system, but there has to be accountability. My frustration is it's not like we actually don't know, right, what would end it, right? Is that we have to change the thinking that women are less than. I mean, this is just that simple, right? When you look at the intent of most of the men who are using violence, most of them want their partner to stop doing something or start doing something, right? It's very intentional. Men aren't just blowing up, right, in an uncontrolled way. That's just not the case, right? They don't always know what their intent is at the time, but it's pretty easy to figure out once you talk to them about what they wanted to be different. So I think that for I just in fact, Scott Miller, who's the director in Duluth, he and I just had this conversation recently, and I said, now we're the old people in this work. Like we're so used to not being those people, but now, we're in our, multiple decade of doing this work. We just had this realization the other day because all of our mentors are retiring. My only I think it'd be interesting to interview one of them who are sort of going out of it, right? Because they have even more experience than I do, but they've seen a lot of things change. It's not as easy for a woman to get an order for protection today, right? And part of that is the laws have sought to help, but they haven't always. So for example, in the state of Minnesota, as in many states, if you have an order for protection against you, you're banned from access to weapons. Well, lots of women in rural Minnesota don't want that, right? They're not scared of that. So I understand the intent of the law, right? And so I would say that there's sometimes been the application of the law that hasn't looked at the unintended consequences. There's huge differences between urban women and rural women, or, BIPOC women or white women, that, we've often sort of developed these policies that have meant to address, the majority of women, but there's lots of women that it doesn't help. I think it's the same thing with police agencies and criminal justice agencies. There are a number of really good ones who are doing really good work, and a lot of them that aren't, right? They know what they need to do, but they're not doing it. What I can tell you for sure is training is not the answer. They've had so much training, right? And so we use a different methodology that looks at, accountability in the organization, how they're linked to other agencies, what their policies are. Most people in those jobs have had quite a bit of training. And what we know is that's not enough in terms. We've gotten a little bit better in terms of culturally appropriate responses. But, from going back to one of the first things I said, which is that, what we would say is that, in any community, they need to go and ask the women. When I think of culture, it means that there's lots of subcultures around Minnesota. The problem, like I said, with so many communities is they're looking to other professionals. And it's like the answer is right in your community. I take
Mhm.
the time to ask the women, and people just don't.
Mhm.
Right? And I would say that's definitely a frustration, and it's so easy to do,
Mm.
right? You can sit down and get 10 women from various, subcultures in your community, and you will learn a ton, right?
Mhm.
About what isn't available in your own community. So the thing that Casa de Esperanza did, why they have a different response, is because they did that, right? They
Mhm.
went out and talked to the women in the community and said, based on how live in the world, what would be helpful, right? And that's why they were organized in that way.
Mhm.
And that's why it's helpful.